the next part of our presentation. So I'm not quite sure how they're going to tag team, but
Here we are. Oh, I got the first bit.
Been coordinating the collective impact component of this project with Perth NRN. And Steph Shorter from Impact Seed are going to reflect on the process, some of the findings from people and their perspective on it as well. So welcome. Thank you.
I need to put these on these days. Thank you very much, everybody. And yeah, so Steph and I are going to do a bit of a tag team. We thought about trying to sort of run it backwards and forwards, but for consistency and continuity in the slides, I'll go through more the basics about the project, and then Steph's going to give us her views as the facilitator and some of the feedback. You know, did we do a good job? Most of you have probably met me at some stage in the project, but for those of you who haven't met me formally or don't know much about me, maybe that's a better way to put it. So yeah, Craig Pensini is my name. So I am the project manager for this collective impact piece that Ingrid went through how that's set up. And I come from a farming background too, which you've probably guessed by Carolyn's presentation. So it's one of my two brothers, but the three of us, we all grew up on a farm just north of Perth. And most of us have been involved or are still involved in agriculture. So to some degree, I was probably a little bit the black sheep of the family. I did manage a property for the family company in Geraldton at a place called Munyanuka, just east of Geraldton, for about 6 years. But I went off and got involved in the crop protection industry and worked in corporate agribusiness for 23 and a half years. And then in 2019, decided that there had to be another way. That's how I felt anyway about where things were sort of heading at the time, and got involved with a startup company in the soil carbon space, and then also with Wide Open Agriculture and Dirty Clean Food as their impact coordinator. And then when this role came along, it was a bit of a natural progression. So yeah, since I got out of corporate agribusiness in late 2019, it's been a real rollercoaster ride, but a really entertaining and interesting one. So anyway, let's talk a bit more about this project and unpack what's happened since I started in September 2023, and we held the first workshop in this room actually back in December of 2023, the first of 4 workshops that we were advised to undertake under the funding arrangement. So out of that first workshop, we did surveys at a regular interval. So this was the first of the surveys, and out of those responses, all of those participants that responded wanted to be involved with the project in an ongoing fashion. There was a lot of excitement, is one way of putting it, but there was a lot of genuine will and trust, and I know there's people here in this room that were involved in the work in that first workshop. But interestingly, you know, not a lot of people, about 50%, but had heard of or knew what collective impact was in that framework. So we knew we were starting from a relatively low and untested base as far as our participants' knowledge and the way that an collective impact framework works. So the next thing that we did is, out of that first workshop, is we actually went and collated all of the responses, because we spent quite a bit of time, and I'll go through some of the pieces that were involved in the different workshops, but went through quite a bit of time understanding what are the issues that we're dealing with, what are the key constraints within our WA farming landscapes, and how would we go about addressing those with a collective impact framework. So the centre of those responses is where this slide shows. There was a strong request for the trust and alignment and collaboration if we were going to have a successful collective impact approach. And we'd already heard, and Steph will probably touch on this, that part of having a collective impact framework was to get an agreed and shared a vision for what we wanted to achieve. How would we look at the effective governance of a collective impact group, and we'll talk a bit more about that. Landscape mapping, which was the genesis of that big poster down the back that Ingrid touched on, which basically is like a baseline of what activities within the sector that we all work in and involved in, what's actually happening now or has happened in recent times, so that we can understand where the gaps were, what were some of the early wins, how First Nations could really be involved and bring some of their cultural learnings and their ability to restore country to this sort of approach. How do we leverage voice and funding, and then sharing the learnings and improving upon that landscape restoration over time. And I like what Carolyn was talking about, that these approaches, these projects are or do generally have long timelines to them. So let's move sort of through the subsequent workshops and what we covered. Ingrid touched on this earlier when she looked at the overall RIF project, Restoration Impact Framework, with what RIF stands for, and the three elements. So just looking at the piece within the collective impact. So the overall workshop attendance, there were 32 over the 4 workshops, 32 different organisations involved, some 44 individual participants, and then some of those participants, which is what the graph shows, attended 1 workshop, some attended 2, some attended 3, and we had those hardened, baked-on supporters who were at all 4 workshops. So if we add all those up, there was 85 attendances across the workshops. So we're pretty happy with that. As I mentioned, 4 workshops, there was an unpacking along the way, along this timeline of the collective impact framework, you know, what was it involved, and we spent a lot of time in that first workshop, yes, getting to know each other. Some of us did know each other relatively well, but others didn't, but we spent a good chunk of time discussing the context of this space, the WA farming landscape, issues that we've been confronted with, what were common understandings around that, then how would a collective impact approach, you know, assist us in finding long-term solutions, discussing this shared vision and purpose, which took a bit of time to nail down. And then, as you showed from our survey work, what was people's commitment? Because at the end of the day, if this wasn't resonating with our initial participant group, then it was going to be a bit of a tough ask. But 100% of people that attended that first workshop said, yes, we see some value in this, we want to continue with this. One of the things that, I'm going to go back because I just really only touched on that first workshop. So the highlighted pieces within workshops 2, 3 and 4 are really the elements or the pieces of work, the key pieces of work that we tackled along the way. And area of change, which I'm going to throw up and show you how that looked. Actions, vision, mission, shared outcomes, a charter and the principles of practice. And thank you so much, Carolyn, for highlighting those principles of practice, because yes, I know for me personally, they resonate as well. We also moved to a point where we have developed a draft strategic approach for what is next. And hopefully that will be like a stage 2 or the next generation of our collective impact approach. So that's already there and ready to get underway. And also we talked about in the last workshop, what a potential governance structure could look like for this collective impact framework. So here we go. I'm going to get you to recite this verbatim at the end of the... No, I'm joking. But there's a lot of material and information in a theory of change, and in this particular case, it was no different, other than, you know, I'm not going to go through any of the pieces in any detail, other than to say that, you know, it is really being tested from within inside the project, and we feel as though we've got a good solid start. But like anything, I think there'll be work if we go forward into a second stage. One of the things that landscape activity map down the back there did was actually inform some of those areas where we could, or we did identify, participants or work groups did identify there were gaps. So this theory of change, as far as, you know, what can be delivered, where are the areas that we can undertake further activity, was informed by that piece of work. This is the draft strategic approach, and I'm using this because it sort of encapsulates a few other pieces of work. So at the top of this, you have our vision and our purpose that we landed on. So the vision of the the collective impact for this strategic approach was that we drive towards a healthy, resilient landscape that enables productive land use and stewardship. And then the purpose of this particular collective impact framework is that as custodians, we collectively drive awareness and action that builds natural and social capital that is valued by all. Now, these were the visions and purposes that the group, as it was through this first phase of the collective impact approach, agreed on. It was what resonated for the group. This is not to say that this vision and purpose will be set in stone. It is something that should have, and I think would have, a changing and a living approach going forward. I think there needs to be, I've often had people say, well, what if this happens? You know, how does our vision and our purpose still resonate? Well, I think that's, it has to be flexible going forward. And then we focused on, or were able to agree upon 5 strategic priorities should we go forward over the next 1 to 5 years. So there's a roadmap here that's ready to go for that next stage. What we agreed back then in this first phase, we should be getting our teeth into in those first 1 to 5 years. The principles of practice, as I said, thank you for your sharing of that, Carolyn, and thank you for that, for the fact that resonated with you and the work that the Malone Institute is doing. We spent quite a bit of time over a couple of the workshops honing this, not so much the actual headings, but the content. I mean, things like consensus-based decisions, and I know a few here in the workshop had some great commentary around this. You know, do we just have a majority decision? No, well, you know, then those people that weren't in that, you know, didn't make the 50 or 51%, you know, where does their opinions land? So, you know, how do you have a functioning group that's spread across such a wide group be able to have consensus-based decisions? So I'm very happy with where we landed with this. And just to finish off with some more tables on the feedback from participants over the workshops. So very happy that we were able to, for those that responded in this particular question, get some really high levels of the satisfaction in the different areas that we covered. So across those different aspects of the collective impact framework. So I think this shows that we were able to hit the mark with the content and the delivery of the framework. Now this slide here is actually part of the evaluation series that Steph and the impact seeders as our evaluators were required to do. So she did a series of one-on-one discussions with selected participants, and these are some of the success factors that came out of those one-on-ones that, you know, we were able to get a good, diverse, inclusive participation. I think things like effective communication coordination, so some really positive feedback on what was successful. This table here just to show that we were able to increase the knowledge of participants. So we surveyed people after workshop 2 and what was your, you know, knowledge increase. We did a better survey after workshop 4 on prior and post, and then the road shows as well, so high knowledge increase. And then further participation, so we have people that want to be involved going forward in the different areas. And then lastly, suggestions on what we need to do for a future phase. And this once again comes out of those one-on-one discussions. And I think Keith will probably touch on some of this in his next steps, but probably no surprises, funding political, First Nations, more authentic First Nations engagement, and then how do we roll out that strategic plan and the shared measurements pieces. Okay, thank you. I'm going to now hand over to Steph.
So Craig and I have been so slick in our co-facilitation up to this point. We may have got a bit rested on our laurels and a bit of confusion about who was talking to what. So I'm just going to go back and talk about a few of the evaluation themes because it feels a bit more genuine because I had the conversations. I'm Steph. I obviously recognise most of you from the workshops, but there are some new people in the room. I'm a director with Impact Seed, and everyone started by talking about their life stories and the farms that they grew up on. So I feel like maybe now that I know most of you well is the time to reveal I didn't grow up on a farm. I'm not an ecologist. I'm not a hydrologist. But my role in this process was actually to facilitate a process and to make space for the conversations that I felt that the collective needed to have to progress through this journey. I will just go back a little bit to talk about the evaluation themes. Hang on a second. So as part of the evaluation, I had a number of, we had the surveys throughout the process, and then I had a number of kind of conversations just to go a little deeper with a few of the participants to understand kind of what has worked and what hasn't. And I want to spend a little bit more time on this. So in terms of diverse and inclusive participation and facilitation, this was something that everyone talked about. Everyone was really, I guess, inspired to be part of a coalition of the willing, and that's what we brought together through these workshops. People were really kind about the approach that we took and felt that we took a gentle approach that really kind of made space for people to have conversations and to really learn from one another, and make space for meaningful big picture conversations. So I really like this quote, which said, "Everyone interacted differently to how I've worked with them in the past. They came out of the weeds to discuss the bigger picture. I hadn't seen this happen before. We were able to shift attitudes and talk about tricky topics like biodiversity. The activities enabled us to hold space for each other, which is really positive." And that's just a great quote to think about, like how the conversation shifted. So a lot of people in the room did know each other, but how often do you get the opportunity or the space to actually kind of rise above the day-to-day things that you're doing and kind of talk about that big picture? The balance between sort of, I guess, getting to know one another, trust building and deliverables. This was on the whole, people felt that the time was used well. It's always a tricky balance. Some people want more time on some things, and obviously, you know, we're at the very start of the journey. Like a 12-month period to run 4 workshops is not very long at all when we think about landscape restoration and systems change. So we did our best there to kind of create the right activities, to have the right conversations, to progress the thinking enough so that we've got a good case to try and get some further funding to continue this thing. But recognising that that's kind of a difficult balance to strike with 4 workshops. The next one was around shared learning and networking. So we had different speakers at every session talk about the work that they were doing. And everyone that I spoke to said that that was a really important part of the process. Heidi talked about the ecosystem leadership in Bali, and I think that really kind of came at a good time when we needed to be stretched a bit in terms of how we were thinking about this. And there were lots of other kind of topics of conversations that people really enjoyed. And then finally, effective communication and coordination. So it is a really big task to try and convene a collective impact project. And Perth NRM have done a great job, and everyone kind of commented on the amount of communication and the cadence of the workshops being about right. If we had kind of had longer to talk about some of the things we wanted to talk about, we probably would have lost kind of participants along the way. So that felt about right. Things for the next phase. Funding and political support. So sounds obvious, but being able to demonstrate economic viability and be able to get that funding and political support for the next phase is really important. Stronger and more balanced governance. So everyone was very positive about Perth NRM's role as the backbone. But to take this forward, we need to have a stronger governance structure, which is something we talked about in the workshops. And we need to have really diverse representation of the different stakeholders within this collective. And there's a question about when we bring that on. You know, it's always hard to kind of establish some of these structures before you've got funding for the next phase. But some of those structures might actually help us kind of, I guess, progress to the next stage. Authentic First Nations engagement. We don't know the kind of solution to this, but it was recognised by everyone that I spoke to that we need to find a better way to create a space that's safe for First Nations people to really be true partners in this process. Another one that's not on there was around place-based case studies. So a few people talked about having kind of demonstration projects or case studies in different landscapes that we could use to highlight successful restoration efforts. Strategic plan and shared measured, obviously we've started that process, but we really need to kind of continue with that. And then collaboration with other NRN groups to make sure that we're consolidating efforts and reducing duplication. As part of the evaluation, I was asked to look at how effectively a collective impact approach has been established, and also has collective impact been a useful method to initiate a systems change process. So just kind of taking those of you that were there back to the first workshop, where we talked about collective impact and what it means. So collective impact is a structured form of collaboration used to bring people together to support systems change efforts. The idea is to bring together diverse actors to learn together, to align and to integrate their actions to achieve a systems level impact or systems level change. These are the 5 conditions of collective impact. And you know, it takes a long time to establish these conditions. So we're really kind of early in that journey, but part of the evaluation, I've kind of reflected on the different components and sort of how we're tracking. So the first one is that it all starts with a common agenda for change. Craig shared the vision and the purpose, and you know, we did get mixed feedback on that process. Some felt that we spent too long wordsmithing, others felt that it was really important to spend a lot of time on that process. You know, the vision and the purpose is the North Star, and that is what holds this whole thing together. And those words need to be meaningful for everybody, even though everyone will kind of relate to them in a different way. So I think that that consensus-based decision-making process that Craig talked about, I think was really important. We spent a lot of time debating and trying to get to that point of a consensus-based decision. We had input from everybody and we valued that input, and we used the collective intelligence of the group to get to that point. Hopefully that is a mutually agreeable kind of solution that we can move forward with. It's not set in stone, but it's hopefully good enough for us to move forward. In terms of shared measurement, we talked about measurement for a collective impact project and the different kind of dimensions that we need to think about. And when we went through the theory of change and then the kind of strategic approach work, we started to think about kind of what are going to be some of the key measures that we all need to have. But there's a lot more work to do there, and this is kind of one of the hardest parts. Really is thinking about how do we measure the behavioural changes, how do we measure the systems changes, and how do we ultimately measure the health of the landscape, which is what we're all trying to work towards. Mutually reinforcing activities. So this is, again, we're kind of at the start of this. I was really impressed that in a pretty short space of time, we did manage to come up with 5 strategic priorities, and we were relatively aligned on the actions, the kind of key actions that need to happen to drive towards the vision. But the next stage is where the hard work comes to make sure that all those different activities are aligned and are kind of supporting each other without duplicating one another. Open and continuous communication, as we talked about a bit already, but I was really impressed and I felt quite privileged to be a part of this group and hear some of the conversations. So I think the communication from Perth NRM was excellent, but the communication between everyone in the room and the listening and learning from one another, I thought was amazing. And then the backbone coordinating organisation is, Perth NRM has acted in that role so far. It's a really, really hard job. Like these convening roles to be the backbone of any kind of collaboration is always underfunded, and it always takes more time to kind of wrangle all the different people together and coordinate these things. So that I think has been a great success of the project. I won't go into detail about this. I looked at the phases of collective impact, and really in the first kind of 12 months of a project, you wouldn't really expect to get beyond that first phase. But across the kind of 4 key areas of governance, strategic planning, community engagement, and evaluation improvement, we have kind of made great progress in all of them. The last question that I was going to look at was around systems change, and was the process and was collective impact a useful methodology to try and establish the conditions for systems change? I've looked at a framework called the Waters of Systems Change. So this was developed by John Canio and Mark Kramer, who also developed the collective impact framework. And what they're looking at here is the different kind of conditions of systems change and how you can look at those to help you think about what needs to change within a system and what actions do we need to change those things to create a system level impact. So on the top, you've got policies. We talked about policies, but these are the rules and regulations in the system. We have practices, so that's what are the individuals and the organisations actually doing. Resource flows, so that's flows of knowledge and money. Then in the middle, the relational change, so the relationships and the connections between different actors in the system, the power dynamics and how that works within the system, and then mental models. So what are deeply held beliefs and assumptions that are influencing actions within the system? And that's the part that we often don't think about, but actually is most fundamental. When we think about, who are the naysayers, who are those that are actually getting in our way, that's what we need to understand what their beliefs and assumptions are so we can start with them. So I looked at this framework to apply essentially what we had done and to say, well, did this process help us to understand those systems conditions? And did it help us to understand kind of where we are now and where we need to go to with respect to these systems conditions to really create a system level impact? So starting with policies, like as Carolyn alluded to, there are no kind of strong policy frameworks that focus on protecting natural capital and food security. And so we know we need to advocate for this, and that's already started. We know also that in terms of funding, it's a low priority to protect, protecting natural capital appears to be a low priority in terms of investment, either public or private. And it's really sad to hear that even projects that have demonstrated great impact are still struggling to get funding. So our second strategic priority is all about optimised funding and policy commitment. The third one is around practices. We've talked about it here today. We know that some of the land clearing practices and farming practices are accelerating the drawdown of remaining soil nutrients, and we need to increase the adoption of more sustainable practices. So again, the third priority in our strategic plan is all about increased adoption of sustainable farming practices. In terms of relationships and connections, again, there's been limited collaboration so far and a lack of a strategic cohesive response at a kind of state level. And that's what's needed. We need a collective voice. And I guess that was the whole purpose of this project. And I think we can say that we've already started to see changes in terms of building trust and collaboration and opening up kind of, I guess, connections for people to work together. And that, again, is one of the strategic priorities, is to increase trust and collaboration. We'll continue to do that. In terms of power dynamics, I think lots of people probably feel that currently stakeholders, whether it's landholders, NRM groups, traditional owners, don't have the strongest voice when it comes to systemic approaches to healthy landscape management. And there are kind of power imbalances within the system. So the hope is that this kind of cohesive, collective, evidence-based approach will give greater voice to everyone to help think about how we can influence the system. And then the last one is around mental models. So I think when we talked through all those different stakeholder groups through the theory of change, there is a general lack of awareness, understanding and belief of the importance of ecosystem services to human well-being, and a general lack of awareness of the negative impacts of some of the current practices. So our fifth strategic pillar is all about that. Like how do we drive positive community and consumer sentiment towards good land stewardship? So this was just a really useful framework, I guess, to say that I think the process that we went through did really help us to understand like what are some of the system conditions that are in place now that are holding us back, and what are the things that we need to be doing going forward to really progress and to really think about how we can have a system level impact and who needs to be involved. And then just one final kind of thing to say is that, you know, this collective impact project is a really important part of this systems change that we're trying to drive towards. And we should definitely celebrate it, which is kind of what we're here to do today. But we should also recognise that system change efforts are really long term. They take a long time and they take a lot of different kind of projects, activities, people to be involved to drive that impact. So we need to be thinking about aligned distributed action. And I just wanted to share this slide, courtesy of Katie, thank you, to say that, you know, collective impact is about collaborative action and getting everyone kind of driving in the same direction towards the shared vision. But to create ecosystem impact, we need to have lots of different people working on different things, but in an aligned way. So that's just a pioneer thought to remember. You know, this is a great first start, but there's lots more to be done and lots of different probably projects and people that are already doing things that we want to kind of bring into this collective. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Big thank you to Steph and also to Kylie and the other members of the Impact Seed team. I know it was hard work, sometimes wrangling, herding the cats and some of our thinking processes, and I think you worked really hard on all of the workshops in bringing people together and really making it them safe spaces for people to have sometimes quite difficult conversations. So it was good, and it was really good to hear some of that feedback today and to get a sense of how it fits within a systems approach. So thank you both very much. And thank you to Craig for all of the work that he's done making these workshops possible.